For communication to succeed, there needs to be someone who can say what they intend to say, a speaker, and someone who needs to understand what has been said, a listener. In this talk, we focus on the listener side of things, that is, interpretation. It has been well established that listeners process utterances incrementally, that is, information is integrated as soon as it becomes available. For example, when we're in a supermarket, in front of the fruit section, and our friend tells us to get a shiny green apple. We first consider all the things there are, then all the shiny things, all shiny green things, and finally all the shiny green apples. However, listeners even go beyond what has been said so far and can infer what a speaker is most likely referring to before the utterance is even complete. For instance, while our friend is still in the process of saying shiny green, we may expect them to end with apple, then watermelon, since there are other types of apples, red ones, but not other types of watermelons. But how do listeners draw these inferences? In this talk, we focus on one such inference called contrastive inference. Consider the following context of objects: two tall ones, a glass and a pitcher, and two other random but non-tall objects, designated by these two stars here. Various eye movement studies have established that when listeners have so far only heard the instruction, click on the tall, they consider both the tall glass and the tall pitcher equally likely to be the intended referent. But if we introduce another object into the display, namely a small glass, listeners prefer the tall glass over the tall pitcher, again before observing the disambiguating noun. So what is happening here? In both contexts, tall only applies to the two upper objects, the glass, which is underlyingly coded as the target object, and the pitcher, which is its size competitor. By introducing a small glass, which is called a contrast here, listeners can apply the following reasoning. If we think the speaker is being cooperative, we expect them to not include more information than necessary. So they could have referred to the pitcher more simply as just the pitcher, and the adjective is only necessary for distinguishing the tall from the short glass. The resulting inference that the speaker must have intended the tall glass is the contrastive inference. Since then, the contrastive inference effect has been replicated in various studies, especially in the size adjective domain. We can easily transfer this reasoning to the color domain. Consider a context where the yellow banana is the target, and a yellow notebook its competitor, and we hear the utterance, "Click on the yellow." In cases like these, participants favor the yellow banana over the notebook when another banana is present, but not otherwise. This replicates the contrastive inference effect we have just seen with size adjectives. However, in the color domain, contrastive inference has been reported to be more fragile. In a series of studies, Zedivi and colleagues did find evidence for contrastive inference in contexts using these yellow banana-like targets, but did not find evidence for contrastive inference when they used, for example, cups instead. Now when participants heard "click on the blue," they did not solely favor the cup, but still also considered the blue comb. This reported fragility of contrastive inference in the color domain is a puzzle, and in this talk we will present a computational model which can actually predict and explain this fragility, specifically in the color domain. However, to do so, we first need to figure out in what way these two contexts differ from each other. Here, Zedivi and her colleagues noted an interesting observation. They conducted a separate study where they investigated how often participants spontaneously produce a color modifier for an object in isolation. They found that blue cup-like items are over-modified more often than yellow banana-like items are. In other words, people call this cup a blue cup, even if there's no other cup present, but they rarely call the other one a yellow banana, but simply a banana. This observation is the basis for our central hypothesis, which is contrastive inference can be explained simply by asking, how likely is a speaker to say yellow in the first place? But not just for the target object, but for each object in the context. This means that the more expected the color adjective is for reference to the target compared to the other objects in the display, the greater the preference for the target should be. In this talk, we will test this hypothesis using a computational model that is couched within the Rational Speech Act framework, where listeners are modeled as explicitly reasoning about production. We can use this model to make quantitative predictions when contrastive inference under this hypothesis should occur. To do so, we will first show how this model makes predictions about contrastive inference based on expectations about production. We will then estimate parameters of this model using empirical data from a production experiment. We will discuss the quantitative predictions the model makes, and finally assess these predictions by comparing the model predictions to data from an experiment probing incremental interpretations of referring expressions. So how does this model work? Let's assume we have a context with a yellow banana, a yellow corn cob, and two other random objects. The speaker wants to tell the listener to pick out one particular item from the scene. While the utterance is still in progress, the listener is trying to make sense of what the speaker is trying to say. To determine what object the speaker is most likely referring to, the listener simulates how the speaker would refer to each object in the display, and crucially, how likely they are to include the color modifier. Since none of the distractors are yellow, the probability that the speaker would use the modifier yellow to refer to them is very small, if not zero. However, there's some probability that the speaker will do so for the banana and the corn cob. Now we would like to get a probability distribution over these objects that tells us how likely a listener is to consider them as the intended target. In the RSA framework, this reasoning is formulated by Bayes' rule. What we want to predict is the most likely referent given an utterance, which is proportional to the production distribution of an utterance given a referent. Based on this reasoning, and given a flat prior, the predicted interpretations are simply the renormalized color production probabilities displayed here in purple. So now we renormalize such that they add up to 100%, and now in blue we have the predictions on how likely a listener is to consider each object to be the intended referent. Now that we know the general intuition, let's apply this to the complete contrastive inference case. As we've established, a speaker is very unlikely to say yellow for both the banana and the corn cob when there's no contrast present. And the same holds for the corn cob in the right context. However, if this yellow banana here was the target, a speaker would have to mention the color to differentiate it from the orange banana, which is why the production probability of yellow here is high. To obtain the listener probability distribution, we again simply normalize these production probabilities. And this is where we see the contrastive inference effect. While the model predicts no preference for any of the two objects in the left context, it does predict a preference in the right context due to the presence of the second banana. If everything boils down to production probabilities, we should be able to change contrastive inference patterns simply by changing the underlying production probabilities. And this is what we're going to manipulate in our experiments. In this talk, I want to focus on one case in particular, which concerns the color competitor. Previous accounts have primarily focused on how different properties of the target object affect preference and contrastive inference patterns. The only requirement for the competitor so far has been to share the relevant feature, here yellow, with the target. However, according to this model, the competitor plays a much more intricate role. Concretely, it predicts that if we can somehow increase the probability to expect to hear yellow for the competitor, it will affect the target preference patterns. It turns out that this is very easy to do in the color adjective domain. There's a well-documented phenomenon in the referring expression production literature which shows that the proportion of color mentioned varies dependent on the typicality of the color for the object, such that speakers simply say banana when it's yellow, but blue banana when it's blue. This allows us to explicitly manipulate how likely listeners are to expect speakers to use color modifiers in the first place. This means that while production expectations for the target remain unchanged, the expectation for the speaker to use yellow to refer to the competitor is higher when it's atypical, like for the yellow strawberry here, compared to when it's typical. In interpretation, a yellow strawberry should therefore be a stronger competitor to the yellow banana than yellow corn would be, and the target preference should be smaller. This is only one example where an RSA model actually predicts variability of target preference and therefore contrastive inference patterns within the color domain. We will now explicitly manipulate the modifier production probabilities of targets and competitors in the display by using typical and atypical stimuli. We created contexts that varied in target typicality, competitor typicality, and contrast presence. First, we used these contexts in a free interactive production experiment to elicit which utterances listeners can expect for the objects in the display. The results were used to obtain RSA model predictions. Finally, the RSA model predicts variation in interpretation dependent on the production probabilities, and we will test in a comprehension experiment whether this predicts the variation listeners actually exhibit. Our production experiment was an interactive reference game with participant pairs from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, where one needed to communicate objects, the other had to select. Crucially, the model needs the proportion of using color when referring to the target, here the yellow banana, and when referring to the color competitor, here the yellow strawberry, which is why we elicited both. Due to the experimental design, there are 8 conditions in total. For the purpose of this talk, I will concentrate on the effect that the typicality of the color competitor has on production and comprehension. I kindly ask you to refer back to the paper for a closer look into the other conditions. We will start with the context where there is no contrast, and target and competitor are both typical. In this case, participants rarely used color to refer to these objects. That means they simply said banana or corn cob. When the contrast, that is another banana, is present, the proportion of saying yellow for the banana increases since it needs to be differentiated from the orange one. The competitor productions are unaffected. Now we contrast this with a context where we exchange the typical color competitor by an atypical one, here the yellow strawberry. While it does not have an effect on how often participants use color to refer to the target, here in orange, the proportion of color mentioned for the competitor, here in green, increases, just as expected. So these are the complete production results for all conditions. Overall, using a Bayesian mixed effects regression model, we find strong evidence for effects of both contrast presence and object typicality. Coming back to our model, we use these empirically elicited proportions of modifier mention to approximate this pragmatic speaker term. We can now use these to obtain predictions about comprehension by simply renormalizing them. These are now our predictions for listeners' preferences. Here we nicely see that in the case where there is no contrast, the model predicts that there is no preference for neither target nor competitor. As soon as a contrast is introduced, the model predicts a target preference over the competitor, creating the general contrastive inference effect. However, the size of this preference is mediated by the color competitor typicality, where an atypical competitor leads to a smaller target preference than a typical one. We now saw the results of the production experiment and used the elicited modifier production probabilities to obtain model predictions. We will now turn to evaluate those model predictions empirically. To do so, we used the incremental decision task. In this task, the utterance is gradually revealed, and at each time point, participants are asked to make a guess which object the speaker is most likely referring to. In this experiment, they made a guess after the adjective was revealed and after seeing the full utterance. Now let's turn to the results. Again, out of the 8 conditions, we will discuss the 3 conditions we have been focusing on in this talk. Firstly, the case where there's no contrast and target and competitor share their typicality. As expected, the selections of target and competitor are a chance. What happens if we introduce a contrast into the display? We would predict that this increases the selections of the target, which is in fact what we find. We can therefore replicate the most classic contrastive inference effect in the color domain, and we did so using an offline paradigm, showing that contrastive inferences can be elicited with measures other than eye movement. Finally, we want to see what happens when the typical color competitor in this context is exchanged by an atypical one. We predicted that this should decrease target preference, and this is in fact what we see. Not only is the target preference reduced, it even results in by-chance selections with the competitor. These results qualitatively replicate the effects we should expect to occur if production expectations modulate target preference. Overall, we found strong evidence that contrast presence, competitor typicality, and target typicality all affect participant selections. We will now show the complete model predictions right next to the empirical results. And we can see that the model qualitatively and quantitatively captures these effects across conditions. Overall, the model reaches a correlation with the empirical selections of 0.91. These results suggest a strong connection between referring expression production and comprehension. In summary, we provided a computational model based on modifier production probabilities, which makes predictions on when contrastive inference should be fragile in the color domain. A comprehension experiment that uses an offline incremental decision task shows the target preference and contrastive inference patterns predicted by the model, suggesting a strong connection between referring expression production and comprehension. In very simplified terms, we can say, we can derive the inferences listeners draw simply from what speakers are likely to say. That is, we can predict listener behavior without considering any additional linguistic or cognitive factors that don't already seem to affect production, all under a highly speaker-centric view of comprehension.